Money FM 89.3, best of weekends.
Let's talk today, though, about these migrant workers' fair living standards and meals. Should there be a standard that's given?
Yeah, this was based on an excellent feature in the South China Morning Post that talked about this very issue, the standard of food, the standard of fare that are given to migrant workers. Of course, many migrant workers pay an amount every month, $100, $150, to a third party who caters the food and delivers to their construction site or wherever they happen to be working. They're 2 meals a day, occasionally 3 meals a day. So it's packaged food. You know, they pay into this. And there's a question over the quality and standard of this food. And in this particular feature, there were some excellent people interviewed, including MP for Nisun, GRC, Louis Sung, and Professor Mohan Dutta, who has written extensively on this topic. So I thought it would be great to get him on the show.
Let's talk to them now. Louis Ng, MP for Nisun GRC, and Professor Mohan Dutta. Great to have you both on Weekend Mornings. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, and because you two can't see each other, we'll go with directing questions. I think that's probably the best way to make sure
because we have Mohan on Facebook Live and we have Louis on the phone.
Exactly. And Louis, let's start with you. You know, you had been talking in Parliament about how it was important for Singapore to provide migrant workers with a fair living standard and decent meals. Well, tell us about the status of that conversation right now. Where are we in Singapore with this idea relating to our migrant workers?
So I've been raising the issue of dormitory standards for quite a few years now. And obviously, as you know, during the circuit breaker, this issue really came to light. And I think we've done a lot now to improve the living conditions for our migrant friends. But that's why I say we should move on to the next phase as well, which really is also about the food they eat, about whether they have enough rest days to make sure that the workers are well looked after. And I always say this, I'm not asking for the migrant workers to be looked after better than Singaporeans. It's not an either or. I think that they have to be looked after because they do hard work for us, and we not just need to show appreciation, but to really make sure that their welfare is looked into as well.
Now, Mohan, you are the Dean's Chair Professor and Director of Care, CARE Care, at Massey University in New Zealand, I believe. And you, in 2015, published an academic report on food for migrant workers in Singapore. For the benefit of our listeners and viewers, could you put it into context, how much they pay and the kind of food they get, how the feeding of migrant workers generally operates in Singapore?
Thanks. So, the 2015 report was built upon ethnographic work that included in-depth interviews, a survey with 500 workers. And then we have in our methodology an advisory group of migrant workers that actually shape the design, the data gathering, and making sense of the data. So in a nutshell, when you look at the food scenario for workers, typically they are paying between $90 to $150 on average. So that's usually
per month.
Yep. So that is usually the range. In most instances, we hear workers saying they are paying around 110, 115 Singapore dollars per month.
And what do they get for that?
So they usually get 3 meals for that. They will get breakfast, they will get a lunch, and then they will get a dinner. And what happens is the workers will collect the breakfast and lunch before heading out to work early in the dawn. And then the dinner typically will be delivered in the afternoon or late afternoon. And then that is consumed after they are back in the dorm in the evening. So that's really what the structure is like typically. Now, one of the things I also want to add to that, Neil, is that typically when you look at a Bangladeshi or an Indian worker, you can think of them on an average earning Singapore dollars 650 per month. There is a range, but that is sort of the average from our data. That can, of course, range from about, say, $500 to $800 often. So really, when you're thinking about the amount of money they are paying, that's a substantive chunk of money that goes toward the food. And you have to also think about why workers are here in most instances to support their families home.
Sure.
So there is always this tension between how much you're going to spend here and how much you're actually able to send home.
Yeah. Louis, they're spending a sixth or an eighth of their monthly salary just to eat. Do you sense that there has been is there any groundswell to make sure that they are getting value for that money, or indeed could that amount be brought down, that amount that they're paying every month?
I think, again, this article has generated good debate on this issue on whether, again, the migrant workers are getting proper food. And I think the debate goes on now. But I think moving forward, maybe what we can do in legislative-wise is to make sure that they are supplied with food and the food is appropriate for them to eat. And that really is the issue now on when they collect the food and when they eat it. And, with most of the buffets you go to, pre-COVID, you got to consume the food within 4 hours. And so this isn't a migrant worker, again, issue, but this is for the entire Singapore. We got to make sure that the food you eat is within 4 hours from the cooking time. And that applies to the migrants as well.
Yeah. And Mohan, do you sense that the quality of food has increased over time, or has it stayed relatively stagnant for the migrant workers?
That's a great question. One of the things that was emergent during COVID in our work is that the quality of food actually has stayed the same.
Yeah.
And through the COVID period, there were many efforts put into place with civil society jumping in, and that really was very good. But something else that we are again starting to hear from the workers is that the quality of the food is deteriorating.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up to that, Mohan. Sorry, there's a follow-up to that in the sense that it's easy to blame the food suppliers, but they would argue their costs, their margins are so thin that they can't send out delivery drivers 3 times. So they'll send out, if I got this correct, they'll send out breakfast and lunches together, and then, as you mentioned earlier, they'll return a second time to deliver dinners. They can't do 3 separate runs. So in effect, our workers in this heat are keeping 2 meals for hours at a time. And often we're hearing stories that the food is rancid by the time they eat it at lunch. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to actually bring up a few key points related to this from our research, Neil. So one is that usually when you think about when the food is cooked, the food is typically cooked for the breakfast and the lunch. The food is cooked the night before often. So, leave aside the 4-hour time, it's actually an extensive gap. So, in fact, workers talk about the food often going stale, often has a smell in it, often is rancid. And this has health implications. So, in our work, we talk about consistent articulations of stomach pain, feeling tired, feeling weak, having to take MCs. And in fact, we published a study where workers also talk about this increasing their risks of workplace injury because of the poor quality of food they have had consumed.
Yeah, it shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. If you eat properly, you're going to have more energy, you're going to be healthier, you're going to not have to take MC, which is costing everybody money and time. And so where do we go from here? I guess, Louis, when you mentioned, a couple of times now, we've started this discussion, we've got it going. A lot of things came to the fore because of COVID-19 as it relates to the migrant workers. Where do you see the dialogue going? And if it goes this direction, where would you see legislation going? And in what time frame?
It's going to be hard to comment on the time frame, but I think the dialogue has to go to the employers now as well as the government on what we can do to study this issue, find a way forward. Because as you say, this isn't just about a food issue, but about productivity as well.
Yeah.
Someone that's suffering from food poisoning can't work.
Yeah.
There'll be man hours is lost. Someone that doesn't get proper food can't work as well as someone who gets a decent meal. And so we need to look at it beyond just a 4-hour food issue and how we can help our workers in the welfare and also increase productivity.
And this is a question for both of you, maybe Louis first, and it's the question that I suspect everyone listening will also be having. Who pays for it? Nobody disagrees that the productivity could easily be improved with better food, better protein, and so on and so on. But who pays for it? The food distributors already say they're working on the finest margins. So therefore, should it be subsidised by the building contractor, their employers, or should the government come in and maybe subsidise it by using part of the foreign worker levy that's collected by the government? So Louis first, You may or may not be able to give an answer on this, I don't know. And then Mohan, who could conceivably pay for this or subsidise better food?
So there are a few suggestions out there. One, obviously, is the employer, and I understand that some employers are already subsidizing the food for their workers. So not paying the full amount, but topping up, again, as you read in the article, so that the food can be delivered 2 or 3 times a day, so the food is fresh. There's, of course, maybe a call also for government grants, whether the government could step in to subsidize for a period of time, especially during this period where a lot of the companies, the employers are suffering, and whether the government then could step in, provide some subsidies so we can ease the transition towards, allowing the food to be delivered a few times a day rather than just once or twice a day. So a few models out there that I think the debate should continue, and perhaps the debate should be brought into Parliament as well.
And Mohan, same question to you based on your research. Who and how could this be paid for, the top-up?
Yeah. So I will give a broad overview, Neil, first, to say that first and foremost in our research, we argue that workers should have a voice. That's the most critical element in this process. So when you actually go to the workers and ask them for solutions, they outline 5 things, and I'm going to quickly talk about those 5 things.
Great.
First of all, they talk about this idea of food and access to food as an issue of worker rights and not one of benevolence, altruism, or kindness. So I think that's an important point in terms of how you frame that conversation. The second point they bring up is the question of the levy that you talk about. And the question for them is, why isn't part of the levy dedicated to worker well-being and support? And they suggest a well-being-based framework in terms of how the levy is allocated. The other point they bring up is the question of minimum wage. So it's perhaps a good time for us to talk about what is the appropriate living wage for workers that would sustain them. Another element they bring up is the concept of infrastructures, particularly. So we have been talking about catering, but if you look at our work, you will see that the workers often also discuss having choice, and having that choice means having an architecture, an infrastructure that enables them to cook. In fact, one of the things that happened in our earlier study was when workers actually put on a cooking show, like a cooking challenge, to demonstrate that with the same amount of money, they could cook good quality food if they had access to infrastructure. And that means that having adequate cooking spaces in the spaces where they stay. And finally, I will come back to this notion of, again, as these conversations are great, but, I will also remind that in 2015, we had these conversations, and Jack Sim, with his work with fortified rice, had actually started an initiative and then seen that there wasn't enough support available for that. So I think in that sense, to sustain this cannot be a one-off conversation, but rather needs to turn to how do we center worker voices in this whole process.
In Parliament and the discussions that are going on, you mentioned a lot of study needs to be done, but we do also know that some basic things could be done fairly quickly to at least improve workers' quality of life. But thanks to both of you for coming on. Louis Ng, MP for Nee Soon GRC, and Professor Mohan Dutta, the Dean, Chair, Professor, and Director of Care at Massey University. Thanks to both of you.